Здравствуйте! Hello! This video is sponsored by the realistic free-to-play vehicle combat game War Thunder. Create an account using the link in the description and get a bonus, free premium tank or aircraft, as well as 3 days of premium playtime. And now, Battle of Midway Animated. It is June 3rd, 1942. Imperial Japanese Navy force is approaching Midway. It is tasked to accomplish several goals. It is to lure the US carriers into combat after invading Midway, while hiding its own numbers by dispersing its fleets. The force is composed of several fleets. The invasion fleet features transport ships supported by battleships and other vessels. They are to disembark troops on Midway. The main carrier strike fleet, hundreds of miles to the north, is comprised of 4 large carriers. Japanese kept the third part of the force several hundred miles behind the carriers, as to deceive the US into thinking Japanese attacking force is less numerous. There were also some additional planes available, operating from distant islands in the back. Their role was mostly scouting and bombing. Japanese sailed into the area, not knowing exactly where US carriers might be. They also thought enemy would respond with 2 carriers, as they thought US had that many left in the Pacific. 1 month earlier, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese thought they sunk US carrier Yorktown. In fact, it was damaged and made way to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Japanese tried to get information about whereabouts of US carriers, but early tries failed. The screening force of submarines that was to arrive first near Midway was late to get into position. Unknown to them, US carriers sailed past them earlier. Japanese flying boats were tasked to fly to French frigate shoals, where submarines would be waiting for them to refuel them. But US Navy ships were guarding it. Thus large planes were not refueled and could not scout the seas. Japanese still proceeded with the plan, despite all those shortcomings, and despite increased electronic emissions picked up from the US, signaling that US carriers might be closer than they thought. Besides the naval force, US had additional planes operating from land. At 9 AM, one of the seaplanes on a scouting mission spotted the Japanese invasion fleet. They mistook it for the Japanese main carrier fleet. Hours later, 9 B-17 bombers took off to attack it. Their attack failed, as they hit nothing. Japanese were unfazed and proceeded with their plan. US was still unsure of exact position of all enemy fleets. Approaching Midway, Japanese carrier fleet decided it's time to attack the US forces on the islands. At the same time, US seaplanes searched the seas and managed to spot 2 Japanese carriers, as well as the inbound Japanese planes. US planes were scrambled. Bombers went off to attack Japanese carriers, while fighters were left to intercept Japanese planes. An air battle ensued, but majority of Japanese planes went through. After the raid, result was that only 2 US planes remained airworthy, but the base itself remained fairly operational. Bombers could still use it. Land-based defenses were mostly unharmed. Since the Japanese plan called for the landing of their troops in mere days, another attack on Midway was needed. As Japanese turned to return to their carriers, US carriers Enterprise and Hornet positioned themselves for attack. They launched their planes, going after Japanese carriers. US had less experience with carrier operations at that point. Example is time that took both sides to launch their first attacks. Of course, that didn't help the Japanese. It started off well for them though. US bomber force from Midway, without fighters, did not manage to fight through Japanese interceptors. While Japanese were low on available fighters, half of their bomber force was available on carriers. Not knowing there are further incoming US planes, Japanese first decided to arm their bombers for attacking the land targets on Midway. A sighting of US fleet was then reported. Japanese considered whether they should attack the US carrier instead, but ultimately decided to proceed with a second attack run on Midway. Had Japanese attacked US carriers then, more US ships might have been hit. They thought a bomber run on US carrier without fighter escort would not make it through. Also, waiting further to rearm the bombers for anti-shipping role would have conflicted with their carriers accepting the returning planes from the first attack wave. Remaining US carrier Yorktown also started launching its planes. US attack formation did not lose time assembling planes in large groups. Their bombers went first, without fighter escort. Unknown to the US, Japanese carriers turned north. So when US planes reached the point where Japanese carriers should have been, they found nothing. Also, due to thick clouds, US squadrons got separated while en route. So now each of them searched for the Japanese on their own. Some went in wrong directions. Eventually, the torpedo bombers found their targets first and started the attack. Japanese Zeros were successful at first, intercepting helpless bombers. It didn't help that the US torpedoes performed badly, with 2/3 of torpedoes that were dropped malfunctioning in some way. Others missed. But the initial attack drew those Japanese fighters away, clearing the way for further US attacks. US dive bombers were coming in from different directions and searching for the Japanese. They were low on fuel, but decision was made to keep searching, even if some planes had to ditch into the sea. They eventually spotted the Japanese, and 3 squadrons of US bombers attacked. All 4 carriers were targeted. Timing was very unfortunate for the Japanese. They did not have extra combat air patrol planes on station, as their existing ones were flying low, having just dealt with US torpedo bombers. Furthermore, since Japanese were in the middle of preparing a strike on Midway, decks of their carriers were full of planes being fueled and armed, which made ships quite vulnerable to damage. Japanese carrier Kaga was hit first by bombs. It was heavily damaged. Akagi was hit minutes later. Almost all bombs missed, but one, which penetrated the hangar deck. It exploded among armed and fueled Japanese planes. Japanese carrier Hiryu suffered no damage, as all bombs missed. Carrier Soryu got hit several times and caught on fire. All 3 hit carriers were engulfed in flames, which kept spreading. While they kept floating, as they had not been damaged below the waterline, they were essentially destroyed. Hiryu, the remaining Japanese carrier, hastily launched a counterattack. Japanese planes followed the US planes as they returned to their carriers and attacked the first carrier they saw. USS Yorktown was hit. With no fire started and repair crews patching up the hole in the deck, the carrier eventually resumed operations. US scout plane made another contact with Hiryu, and US carriers launched more planes against it. But Hiryu launched its own second wave of planes, going into the last known location of US fleet. They found a carrier which seemed undamaged and hit it with 2 torpedoes. US own counterattack succeeded. Japanese carrier was damaged and the fire started to spread. Hiryu too was lost. As the night approached, no more air attacks were performed. USS Yorktown listed by 23 degrees, and no more operations could be performed from it. Remainder of the Japanese fleet, still numerous in battleships, initially kept pressing and searching for US carriers. US forces decided not to pursue and stick closer to Midway, in case it needed to be defended. Eventually, Japanese stopped. During 5th and 6th of June, US forces managed to locate and engage several individual Japanese ships. But no side scout planes managed to find each other's main fleet. The last loss of the battle was that of USS carrier Yorktown. As it was towed to harbor, a lone Japanese submarine stumbled upon it. 2 torpedoes hit the carrier. USS Yorktown finally sunk on early morning, June 7th. Total casualties of the battle were immense for the Japanese. The 4 carriers they lost made up roughly half their carrier capacity up to that point. Building and converting more carriers was a slow process. Unlike for US, whose industry was churning more and more carriers from 1943 onward. Also, Japanese lost a quarter of their seasoned pilots in this single battle. More and more planes in subsequent battles were piloted by inexperienced youngsters. Factors contributing to the outcome included US carriers being larger. Smaller Japanese carrier maxed out on airplane capacity, while sacrificing sturdiness. Even though Japanese had another working carrier, Zuikak, they chose not to try and assemble an air wing for it and use it in battle. Some US ships had radars, detecting enemy strike forces from over 60 miles away, while Japanese had no radars. Japanese destroyers were also not well equipped for anti-aircraft fire and were used further away from the carriers. US used theirs close to the carriers. But the greatest factor in the battle was the fact the US had been, for some time, deciphering Japanese radio messages. They had used the intelligence prior in the Battle of the Coral Sea and now to devastating effect at Midway. While Japanese knew little of US starting numbers and positions, the US knew all the key points, allowing them to match Japanese in numbers if they concentrated their carriers. The Japanese also had another part of the fleet near Midway, but that force was tasked with taking some Aleutian islands. Japanese high command thought it would not need their assets for Midway and wanted to strike at two places at once. In the end, Japanese lost all the initiative in the Pacific, and US went on to win the whole war. Big thanks goes to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. This free-to-play online game features more than 1,000 historically accurate and playable tanks, ships and aircraft from 1930s to 1990s. You can recreate all sorts of battles, including the Battle of Midway, pilot famous fighters such as the US Wildcat or the Japanese Zero. Fight with millions of players in realistic combined arms battles. Join us in battle for free by clicking on the link in the description below. You'll get a special bonus, a free premium tank or aircraft, and 3 days of premium playtime. Big thanks goes to all my patrons on Patreon. Without you, we wouldn't be able to make as many videos. Do subscribe if you like my content, and if you want to be notified about new videos, don't forget to click that bell button.